that the study of systems concepts could be something that we could easily take 2 or 3 courses on. So what we'll be doing is hitting some of the highlights of systems theory, particularly those aspects of systems theory that I'm going to be wanting to talk about, many of which have been used in family systems theory and therapy, some of which are only now beginning to be used or haven't been used yet. Number 1 is the idea of organization. Organization focuses on relationships, how elements of a system are organized. Family systems theory has been considered and described, particularly by family systems theorists, as a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is one of the most popular words you can use. If you really want to say, hey, you know, this stuff is really different, that's what you call it, a paradigm shift. And suggest it's a whole different way of looking at things. It's not just a shift within the old paradigm. It's a whole different way of looking at things. And one of the key elements here in this new way of looking at things is that you look at things not in their individual qualities, but you look at the nature of the organization of those things. How the elements are organized. It's the organizational pattern that is important. Now, of course, in family systems therapy, the reason why that's seen as a paradigm shift is it's a different way of looking at dynamics as compared to individual conceptualizing dynamics in terms of individuals. Because the paradigm shift then becomes the individual becomes one of the elements in the family system. And so it's how the family is organized and how the individuals in the family relate to each other in terms of ongoing interactions that is the stuff that psychotherapy and understanding dynamics should be made of. So the shift is from an individual focus to a trans-individual or family systems focus. But that represents an application of systems thinking to the family. Because the shift from an individual in the family to the family is an application of family systems to the issue of family as a system. But systems language, apart from that, says that the organization of anything is what's important. The way in which things are organized, any system, whether it's a family system or an individual system or a biological system or an economic system or social system. The pattern of organization is what's important. If you want to apply that to a family, then it's the pattern of the organization of the family. What's interesting from an Adlerian point of view is this whole idea of pattern of organization is the central concept in the word individual in German. Indivisible. You can't break it up into parts and understand it. You have to understand how the parts relate to each other. And another language for saying that is the pattern of organization. So we begin to see that Adler's view of the individual is a systems view of the individual. Because we look at, the whole idea of lifestyle as a pattern is to look at the pattern of various aspects of the individual and how they relate. Also, looking at the individual in a social context is looking at the context of society and the context of others and the context of the social group, including the family, in terms of the pattern of interaction there as well, and how the individual relates to and is involved in that pattern. So we see either explicit or implicit in Adlerian psychology the idea of systems thinking in a very subtle way. One is a systems view of the individual as holistic pattern of organization. Another is including the social system and a group, including family group, and even further, beginning to explore the relationship between the two, how the individual relates to the group, how the individual fits in the group, how the group influences the individual, how the individual influences the group, which most theories don't address. Okay, number two, second characteristic of systems theory is holism. Now, remember, this is part of the paradigm shift. It's not a paradigm shift for an Adlerian. One of the reasons you're attracted to Adlerian psychology is because it's a holistic perspective. At least for many of you, that'll be the case. But what family systems theorists, one of the reasons they got attracted to family systems theory is they didn't like the premises of psychoanalytic or behavioral, and now cognitive behavioral therapy, in terms of the fact that they were reductionistic and were not holistic. So it's another aspect of systems theory that already is present in Adlerian psychology. The idea of holism is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And Jan Smuts, who has developed the concept of holism, first coined the term. And the idea is that not only is the whole more than the sum of its parts, but no element of a system, none of the parts themselves can be understood in isolation from the whole of which it is a part. That we have to understand each part in relationship to the whole. And Adler adopted Smuts's view in terms of holism. And particularly, again, focused on the individual and the idea that you cannot break up the individual into parts. Cognition, affect, body, mind, id, ego, superego. You have to look at the individual as a whole, as a totality. And understanding any aspect of the individual requires that you understand that individual or that part of the individual in relationship to the individual as a whole. Now, his whole view of lifestyle is built around that idea. That understanding lifestyle, understanding the lifestyle goal, understanding the law of movement, all concepts which Adler developed, all refer to the totality of the individual, and that all then aspects of the individual, physiology, physical symptoms, psychological symptoms, emotions, behavior, thoughts, all fall in line in relationship to the goal, in relationship to the movement, in relationship to the lifestyle as a totality. Within the different, if you look at the field of personality theory, lifestyle theory is certainly a way of looking at personality that is fair, that is complete as a theory and different from other theories and can be contrasted to other theories of personality. And so within the field of personality, paradigm really isn't a good word to use, but theoretical point of view.
In the sense of mental blueprint.
Well, yeah, it's a mental blueprint, definitely. And a different way of thinking of personality. And one of the things I'm trying to highlight in this class is that one of the ways in which it's a different way of looking at personality when contrasted to other ways of looking at individual personality is with respect to these systemic concepts. Another way of saying this is that if the people who developed family systems theory, see, the people who developed family systems theory did it in reaction to, and to a large degree in rebellion against, individual therapy and conceptualizing individuals in terms of personality theory. And the theories that they were rebelling against were psychodynamic, psychological, psychoanalytic theories primarily. But if those people had adopted an Adlerian point of view of individual personality, then they couldn't have had the same reaction in terms of developing systems theory. They still might have developed systems theory, but it wouldn't have been in rebellion against all of what individual therapy and individual personality theory stood for. Because Adlerian psychology is different from the other points of view in this way. This way meaning in terms of its systemic thinking. That's one of the things I'm trying to highlight today. Okay, let's talk about number 3, and systems theorists see a family as an open system, so let's talk a little bit about what an open system is. An open system receives and discharges matter, energy, or information. It's a definition of an open system. It receives and discharges matter, energy, or information. Depending on the kind of system it is, it may interchange any one of these. So an open system is dependent upon interchange with its environment for its survival. Closed systems just operate within themselves. Some chemical reactions are examples of closed systems. That once they start, they just react within themselves. But living systems are examples of open systems that interact with the environment and need to interact with the environment in order to survive, in order to exist. Adler's view, for example, that lifestyle is understood as in the social context is an example of an open system interchanging information with its environment. So here we're using Adler's theory of lifestyle of the individual as an example of an application of the concept of open system to the individual, that the individual is an open system. Now, by the way, that's a good way of contrasting, if we're talking about lifestyle theory in contrast to other theories of personality, in reaction to which family systems was developed. Saying that the individual is an open system that interacts and exchanges information with the broader social system, what we sometimes call the embeddedness principle in Adlerian psychology. The individual is embedded in a social context. To say that is very different than Freud's concept of drive psychology and pleasure principle functioning that says that the primary drive or motivation of an individual is based on their biological impulses and drives, particularly libidinal and aggressive drives. And their main relationship to the outside world is in terms of the extent to which these drives get thwarted or satisfied. That's a much more isolationist kind of view of the individual, where the only relevance to the outside world is in terms of these drives. Whereas Adlerian psychology is much more oriented toward looking at the individual as an open system, not tending toward tension reduction around drives, but interacting with the environment, and that the ideas in terms of lifestyle and movement and goal all are related to a social context. Asking an adult for their feeling is another example. Now I'm using the example of when we look at a mistaken goal of a child. We're going to take a look at that systemically. When you look at a mistaken goal of a child, how do you find out what the child's mistaken goal is? Well, there are several clues. One's the actual behavior of the child. But another is that you ask the adult, what was the adult feeling when the child did that behavior? And if the adult says, well, I was angry, that is a clue that the goal of the child's behavior was power. The adult says that they were annoyed. That's a clue that the goal of the behavior was attention. The adult says they felt hurt. It's a clue that the goal of the child's behavior was revenge. But what I want you to see at this point is that the fact that we ask those questions and think of these terms suggests not merely that we're trying to understand the child's goal, but it reflects this systemic and intersystemic concept that the goal of the child's behavior is directly related to the social context in which it occurs, and in fact is intended to affect that social context. For example, the adult, in the presence of whom the behavior occurs. So the behavior is related to and in relationship to the adult. So it's systemic in two ways. One, that the child is an open system interchanging behavior and reaction with other people. In this case, we're talking about the adult. And their behavior is only understood in that context. So that's clearly an open systems concept. The other idea, which we haven't addressed yet specifically, but is perhaps the most dramatic example of systemic thinking from an Adlerian point of view, is the idea of a goal. Of goal-directed behavior. Behavior is goal-directed. The idea that behavior is goal-directed is one of the key concepts in systems theory. And we will talk a lot more about that later on. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I'll be doing is I'll be handing out 3 figures that I've developed. One is the basic elements in a homeostatic system. The second is the basic elements in a homeostatic system from an Adlerian point of view. So we'll look at the lifestyle as a homeostatic system. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to use that to also show how Adlerian psychology extends and integrates cognitive behavioral approaches with systems theory. Because we're going to use a systems language to describe Adlerian psychology and then look at cognitive behavioral therapy and see how it's not a systems theory, but how it can be, if you add the concept of goal-directed behavior, become a systems theory, and therefore can be brought into this integration and integrating cognitive behavioral with systems theory of the individual, which then allows you to integrate the systems theory of the individual with family systems theory. You follow that? Well, some of you did, some of you didn't. That's okay. That's coming up. When we do the charts, you'll see. You'll see it. It'll be clear. Now, in order to get a better idea of what an open system is, let's talk about what a closed system is. A closed system has no exchanges with the environment, and it tends toward entropy or disorganization. Entropy or disorganization means that over time it dissipates. It loses its structure, it loses its interactions, and kind of peters out and winds up being kind of zilch, nothing. For a long time, it was felt that that was characteristic of most systems, and including the universe. That the universe was entropic, that it was winding down. A depressing thought. Fortunately, it takes so long for the universe to wind down that we're not going to be around when that. Actually, there's been a lot of work in chemistry and other areas of talking about systems that actually create structure and are what are called negentropic. Neg because they're not entropic, so that they actually build up structure. And very exciting when those discoveries were made, because it was assumed up to that point that all chemical systems ran down. Now, So we see that Adler's view of individuals, families, groups always was in terms of open systems, which is consistent with modern systems theory. The next concept that's the key to understand is homeostasis. Homeostasis refers to a dynamic equilibrium or steady state. And that's what homeostasis means. Homeostasis means steady state. And that is that the state of the system is relatively steady around some central tendency, particularly, and that central tendency is usually thought of as a goal state. Yeah, let's take an Adlerian example of that. Let's take, first of all, in terms of goal-directed behavior, the idea, the Adlerian idea that behavior was goal-directed as a homeostatic, translate that into systems theory and saying that behavior is homeostatic around a steady state, which is the goal state. And now let's take an example of that, which would be a child who is pursuing an attention goal. And it's a good example of goal-directed behavior and homeostasis, because the steady state for a child who's pursuing the goal of attention is around the goal of attention. That when that goal is reached, that things are stable. And the behavior is intended to create that state, that steady state of being in the attention of whoever the person wants to be receive attention from. So the goal state exists prior to the behavior. The child has a goal of attention getting. Then the child does something. And the teacher says, "Richard, why are you doing that? Stop doing that." Okay. So now the focus of the whole class and teachers on Richard, who just attracted attention. So if the child's goal is to attract attention, I only feel significant when I am the center of attention, then at that moment, that goal is satisfied. They have influenced the group in such a way that the teacher and the group has paid attention to that person. And what do we know about attention-getting behavior at that point? It stops. From a systemic point of view, it stops because the relationship of the child as an open system to the context or environment in which the child is in, the child has created a response in the environment that fits the goal. And behavior that fits the goal then doesn't need to be done anymore. So it stops. Of course, then it starts again at some later time, but for the moment it stops. Now, let's say the goal is power. So homeostasis now, steady state, for the child who's power-oriented is not around attention. It's around power. So what happens when a child does something, who's power-oriented, goal is power, child does something, and the teacher pays attention and gives the child attention. Since the goal state is not attention, the goal state is power, attention doesn't stop the behavior because the goal state hasn't been reached. That central tendency of the child as an open system, homeostatic system, hasn't been reached. But when the parent or the adult gets angry and starts engaging the child in a power contest, then the child's goal has been reached. And so the goal of the child is to engage the adult into the power contest. And that's the open system. That's the steady state around that. To use another example, now those are goals of immediate behavior. They're not lifestyle goals. right? Goals of mistaken behavior are transitory, the same, a child can do 2 or 3 of them in a day. They relate to behavior in particular situations, not the lifestyles. So let's talk about a lifestyle goal. That's a much higher order goal. So it's a higher level of homeostasis that we're talking about. So if a person has a lifestyle of a controller, or in my topology, controller organizer, my idea of and the Adlerian types of styles is a little different from what you're more familiar hearing. So let me talk a little bit about the difference. In my reading of Adler, the main idea of the goal of a lifestyle is such that to say that the person's goal is, let's say, that of a controller or a pleaser, that's not actually the goal of a lifestyle. It is a discouraged expression of a lifestyle goal without social interest, or with a relatively little social interest. So it's rather a role that a person plays and a goal within the broader lifestyle goal. The broader lifestyle goal includes the potential of expressing a lifestyle with social interest. So I developed a topology that had two sides to it. So instead of saying this person is a controller and the goal of their lifestyle is to control, in my topology I would say that this person is a controller organizer who may be acting as a controller, pursuing a goal of control, but that's a mistaken idea. And that they can develop a more socially interested expression of their lifestyle goal in terms of making a contribution, but still within a relatively unique lifestyle, like being an organizer, which is the positive expression of the goal of creating order, which is what I call the goal of that style. Okay? So the pleaser in my topology becomes the pleaser diplomat. So that we can see the positive expression and positive potential behind discouraged lifestyles. But theoretically, what's interesting is they actually become just an expression of a lifestyle, not the whole lifestyle itself. So the controller is not a lifestyle. It's a discouraged expression of a lifestyle that pursues order, but is doing it in a discouraged way, with the belief that only if I am in control can I be safe and secure and significant. And the more positive expression of that lifestyle is, I don't have to be in control. But I like it, and I prefer it. And I can contribute to the world through my skills in being able to see control issues and being able to help people be more organized. But I don't have to do it all the time. And it's not my only alternative, my only way of looking at things, my only strategy. Okay? The fact that there's a fictional final goal in the lifestyle is one of the main indicators that Adlerian psychology, at the level of lifestyle theory, the whole personality, sees the individual as an open system. And that goal also is a homeostatic goal. It's a steady state. Because in the extreme, let's take the extreme cases of the discouraged lifestyles, where I do believe that I must be in control, for example, in order to be significant and secure. That my orienting goal, my homeostatic steady state as an open system, is to be in control in relationship to the environment. And that my behavior is designed to pursue that goal. My behavior is designed to create a relationship with the environment where that goal is reached. And any deviation from that goal triggers thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and behavior. Thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Any deviation from that goal triggers behavior that's designed to decrease the difference, the deviation, and so that I can pursue that goal. Okay? So, what happens if the controller experiences something that they regard as surprising? They did not anticipate this. What does a controller tend to do? What are some of the behavioral or cognitive responses when the controller is confronted with something they did not anticipate? Increase their sense of power by taking charge. The problem that controllers particularly run into is when the original problem is caused by their desire to or attempt to control. Because then what happens is that their attempt to try and solve the problem is to increase the cause of it, which actually is a paradigm for all kinds of neuroses, all our neurotic responses, that we try to create our solution and without realizing that the solution we're trying to create is the cause of the problem in the first place. So we're making it worse, or at least doing the same thing, trying harder but not trying differently. Let's take another example of what in lifestyle terms we call a victim martyr. So if the victim is in pursuit of demonstrating injustice, so what happens when you try to cheer the victim up relative to their goal, relative to that steady state? You are deviating from that steady state in your feedback. The glass is really half full. Have you looked at it this way? Relative to the steady state of security and significance, that is a threat, which triggers thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, part of the person, to try and bring the relationship to you, the environment, social context, and themselves more in line with the steady state homeostatic goal. So what do? They sigh and say, "You don't understand." So they're back into a situation where they're now a victim of your misunderstanding. Or they try to point out to you, they help you out, they try to point out to you how things are really bad, you're just not seeing it. So they'll come up with other examples of things that are bad. And if you try to argue with them about that, then they'll come up with more examples. Or just give up. But you see how that's related to, or can be seen as an example, of looking at an individual as a homeostatic open system, pursuing a steady state of a particular goal. Any deviation from that goal is seen as a threat to the survival of the system, and triggers behavior on the part of the system to try and reduce the deviation from the goal. Now, I've been talking about that in language of Adlerian LifeStyle. What you will see is that that language of deviation from the goal and trying to reduce the deviation from the goal is generic systems theory. It is true of all homeostatic systems, not just lifestyle. Lifestyle is just an example of it. But it is a wonderful example of how Adler's theory of lifestyle is a homeostatic systems theory. That the emphasis in homeostatic systems, open homeostatic systems, is on stability rather than change. It has in fact been one of the prime kinds of systems or kinds of dynamics that have been described in family systems theory that systems theorists have now criticized family systems theory for. Because the kind of systemic process that happens that creates change is not emphasized in a homeostatic process. A key concept in terms of systems theory and both homeostasis and also morphogenesis. Negative feedback is not negative in the sense that it's bad or critical. Negative feedback in systems terms It's called negative because it's based on subtraction. It's based on a difference. And in particular, it's based on the difference between a current state and a goal state. So where there is a difference between the current state and a goal state, that's called a deviation. And when the system functions as homeostatic systems do, to reduce that deviation or to correct the deviation from the goal state, that process is called negative feedback. And so causation becomes not linear, like A causes B, what often is called efficient cause, but it becomes teleological, in other words, goal-directed. Now, some of you have read some of Adler know that Adler's theory of causality is a teleological theory. That's what goal-directed behavior means. And some of you also have known the history of Adlerian psychology, know that Adler was rejected to some extent because of his theory was teleological, because up until recently, the idea of something being caused by the goal was seen as fatalism, because the goal of something is something in the future. It hasn't happened yet. So something happened in the future would cause something in the present was like was thought of in the early up until the early mid part of the century of being fatalistic. But Adler's idea was that the goal was an idea that was present in the person's psyche prior to behavior, that then subsequently was generated by the individual in order to move the individual in relationship to the environment toward a goal. Now the problem with that, and the issue with that, is that, and the thing that systems theory helps Adlerian psychology, is that the introduction of the idea of feedback loops and the introduction of the idea of feedback as causal, in other words, that the behavior in a homeostatic system is caused not by some antecedent condition or by some goal that's off in the future and hasn't occurred yet, but by the feedback that occurs in relationship to the goal, comparing the goal to an external situation, that deviation reduction feedback. That's what's causal. That was a paradigm shift. That was a new idea. But that's what Adler had been talking about. That's why I'm so convinced that if Adler was developing his theory currently, or relating his theory to current models, that homeostatic and systems theory would be an essential model for him to use. And that it begins to bring some of the things that have been relegated in Adlerian psychology by others to, well, that's not scientific. The idea of the creative self, the idea of the active self, that's not scientific. Well, now it is. And this is some of the language. There's some other things that some of which we won't talk about, but some of which we will, that also contribute to this. So deviation means a difference between the current state and the goal state. And in generic terms, the general idea of a system is that we have a sensor. These are the key elements, the minimal elements necessary for a homeostatic system to exist. And you'll notice that these are true for non-living systems as well as living systems. These are true for mechanical things like thermostats, guided missiles, as well as for living things. There are some other qualities that living systems have that mechanical systems do not, Non-living systems do not, and we will get onto those in a little while. But for now, let's talk about the numeric minimum requirements for a homeostatic system. So we have a sensor. The role of the sensor is to select input and basically evaluate the current situation, to read the current situation. This is the interface between the system and its environment. The sensor senses the environment. Okay. The next component is called an evaluator or a comparator. And the evaluator evaluates the input or compares the input. And what it compares it to is the goal state. So that's what it's called. It's called a comparator. It compares the initial situation, condition, to the goal state. In a homeostatic system, that comparison generates what's called mismatch information. It's mismatched to the extent that the information from the sensor doesn't match the goal state. There's a mismatch. That's the negative feedback. That's the deviation. In a homeostatic system, the goal is to reduce the deviation between the goal state and the current state, if there is a deviation. So that generates a selection of behavior. A selector, which is the next aspect of the system, that selects from the repertoire of behavior that the system is capable of. It selects that behavior which is designed to reduce the mismatch, to reduce the deviation between the current situation and the goal state. And so then the next thing happens is some behavior is emitted, generated by the system. That behavior affects the environment. So then we have an environmental response, which then is also input and feeds back into the system. System reads the current situation again, compares it, sees if there's a mismatch. If there is, to reduce the mismatch, and selects behavior that then is made and it has an impact on the environment. The whole thing keeps on going until there's an overlap, until the deviation is very small or non-existent. Then what happens is the selector says, we don't need to behave anymore. We don't need to do this behavior anymore, so we stop the behavior. But there still is always, that's because the nature of an open system, is it always is interacting with the environment. And as long as there's no big deviation, then things just continue to run along. But then when the deviation increases, boom, we get the thing kicking in again. Now, the next thing we're going to do is going to use the most common, simplest example of a deviation-reducing homeostatic system, and that's a thermometer. No, that's not a thermostat. Thank you. Thermometer is part of the thermostat, but not the only one. So, with the sensor, in the case of the thermostat, we got a thermometer. The thermometer is the sensor for a thermostat. It reads the temperature in the room, and that's the environmental input. So the environmental input is the temperature. That's the only thing that the sensor cares about, of the thermostat. It's the only thing it knows. It doesn't read colors, shapes, feelings, any of that stuff. Just temperature. It's the only thing that's meaningful. Okay, so we have the thermometer. Then what happens? Well, somebody set this thermostat. let's say it's set for 74 degrees. That's what the thermostat is set. This is the goal state. That's what it's set at. So that becomes the goal state. Notice that the goal state can vary. It could be set at 74, it can be set at 80, it can be set at 70. But once the goal state is set, then that is the standard against which deviation is measured relative to the goal state. So let's say the input is that temperature 70 degrees. So it's 70 degrees and the mismatch of 4 degrees. That's the deviation. Because this is a homeostatic system tending towards steady state, maintaining the steady state, that means now that we want to maintain a temperature of 74 degrees. We've got a temperature of 70 degrees. So the deviation is 4 degrees, and we want to reduce the deviation. So the selector says, well, how do we do that? Okay, turn on the heat. You do that? Turn on heat. Heat turned on is the behavior. What's the purpose of this behavior? What's the purpose of this behavior, turning on the heat? Yes, to warm up the room, but that's not systems language. To reduce the deviation between the room temperature and the goal state is the accurate answer to that question. And you see, therefore, the true meaning of teleological behavior. Is that getting clearer to you in terms of what teleological behavior really means? And why it is systemic? And why it is a sophisticated theory, not a simple theory? Much more sophisticated than simple causality, A causing B, which is called linear causality. See, that's the other reason for the paradigm shift. One of the reasons for the paradigm shift to systems thinking is linear causality can't handle this kind of thinking. And this isn't the most complicated systemic thinking. We'll get into more complicated systemic thinking. But linear causality can't handle it. And most theories of personality are seen as, at least by the systems theorists, as being linear. But obviously, as is probably clear to you, but will be absolutely clear to you in a moment, Adlerian theory is not linear. It is systemic, because this is Adlerian theory. Before Adler knew that this is what he was talking about, because it wasn't developed yet. Okay, so we turn on the heat. The heat affects the environment. Namely, it warms up the room. But the purpose is not to warm up the room. The reason why it's inaccurate to say, or incomplete to say, that the purpose is to warm up the room is it doesn't include the idea that the function of this behavior doesn't lie just in the environmental response, but in the feedback of that response to the internal mechanism of the system, especially the goal state, and whether there's a match or a mismatch between the environment and the goal state. That's the key, okay? So then the temperature goes up to, let's say, 72 degrees. We get to the comparator. Compares the goal state of 74 degrees, 72 degrees, minus 2 degrees. Evaluator then moves over to the selector. The selector says, well, keep the heat turned on. Still too low. Heat remains turned on. Environment responds. Heat temperature goes up. Gets to 74 degrees. The mismatch is 0. Goal state hasn't changed. Goal state is the same. But now the mismatch between the goal state and the environment is 0. So then there's a signal, turn off heat. Heat is turned off. Now, if you also have an air conditioner, and this doesn't happen here, but actually it has happened recently in LA. We have very hot fall, temperatures in the 80s and 90s, until about third week in October. And then it got, you're going to laugh at this, of course, it got cold. I knew you'd laugh at that. I haven't even told you what it means yet. You're laughing at it. So the temperatures went down into the 60s during the day and the 50s at night. And so, of course, we turned on our heaters. Set the thing for 74, and that was it. But then we got a return of what we call a Santa Ana condition, which is winds off the desert. And so yesterday in LA, the temperature where I live was 91 degrees Fahrenheit. So we had the air conditioning back on. See, so you do switch back and forth. So then if the room temperature, let's say we still have it at 74 degrees, the room temperature goes up to 78 degrees, there's going to be a mismatch, 4 degrees in the other direction. So the selector says, don't do anything with the heat. Keep the heat off, turn on air conditioner. So air conditioner is turned on, environmental response, the temperature starts going down until it gets 74 degrees and it's going to turn off. So you see that the goal state responds to any deviation up or down, and a homeostatic system acts to reduce the deviation. And the causality is a feedback process, a relationship between the homeostatic system, particularly the sensor. You see, the homeostatic system is this part. The sensor, the evaluator, and the goal state, the selector, and the behavior, and then there's the environment. It's a relationship between the two. Okay? Because now, figure 3 is the lifestyle is a homeostatic goal-directed system. So let's look at the lifestyle. What we call the schema of apperception or private logic, basic assumptions or beliefs about self, life, and others, corresponds to the sensor. That's the part of us that creates meaning out of input that we receive from the environment. As an open system, we're interchanging with the environment, and this part of the interchange is we interpret what's going on. Just as the thermostat interprets the temperature, but being human beings, we've got a lot more to interpret, a lot of kinds of stuff to understand and sense. And of course, we sense, this is just personality. We have all kinds of sensors that are based on physiological responses, even at the cellular level, but we're talking about personality level. So the sensor selects, when we talk about selective attention, that's what we're talking about, to certain kinds of input in the current situation, and we create or attribute meaning to that input, which is one of the aspects of Adlerian lifestyle theory. Now, the evaluator or comparator. Well, that's what we call in lifestyle the fictional final goal. And it's a goal in exactly this sense of a homeostatic system. We also could talk about the immediate goal of the behavior, but for now we're talking about the general lifestyle, so we're keeping it at that level. So with regard to lifestyle, what happens, this part of the homeostatic process, is that there's a comparison of subjectively created meaning in the sensor aspect of the system to the subjectively chosen goal or ideal. In what way is this situation different from my goal, my lifestyle goal? Okay? How are we doing relative to feeling secure and significant?
Excuse me.
Yes?
Why do you call it a fictional goal?
Oh, well, and the Ansbacher talks about it as a fictional goal, and the reason it's fictional, it comes from a term from Heinz Weihinger's philosophy of as if. The philosophy of as if, Weihinger wrote around the turn of the century, and Adler was very excited about it because it fit his way of thinking. And the idea is that people respond to ideas about the world, not to the world directly. And what Weihinger did is he talked about this as if. People act as if certain beliefs were true. And these beliefs he called fictions because they were created. They were fictional rather than real, although people acted as if they were real. One of the things that we want to do is help all of us to understand that our world is fictional, but it's based on what goes on, and we don't experience it as fictional, but it's all created as if it were a story. And where that's functional, that's fine. Where it's dysfunctional, we need to take a look at it and create other fictions. What Adler used to call more useful fictions. One of the things I like, one of the things Adler said was that the goal of life is to make smaller mistakes. Smaller errors. Not the, you can't eliminate bias. You can't eliminate to the total extent fiction because it's part of being human. It's not bad. It's just part of being human. But we can reduce the degree to which of the dysfunction, both at the level of the sensor, using this language, in terms of our scheme of apperception, sometimes that we're in the habit of creating meaning that is distorted, and we can decrease the distortion of that meaning. In fact, one goal of Adlerian psychology is to appreciate the fact that all of our ideas about ourselves, all of our personality, concepts, our friend. Oh, those too. Yeah, I was going to get to that. Are fictions. They're fictions in the sense that they're created. Everything that I have said today is a fiction. Systems theory is a fiction. It's created by, it doesn't exist in nature. Created by people as a way of looking at things. Ways of looking at things are fictions. So the question is it useful or not? And the arguments in personality theory and throughout psychology are arguments about fictions. Mine's better than yours. Well, so that's the reason why we say fiction. So then we have the selector based on this. So if you have a lifestyle goal, any of the lifestyle goals, controller, organizer, pleaser, diplomat, victim, martyr. A person chooses, now we're on to the selector in terms of lifestyle. A person chooses from a repertoire of behaviors. And these are lifestyle patterns, lifestyle behavior patterns. Sometimes we call them modus operandi, methods of operation in the lifestyle summary. Sometimes we call them tactics, and sometimes they're symptoms. From an Adlerian point of view, to say that behavior is purposive or goal-directed, and to say that symptoms are goal-directed is exactly in this sense. And that is that behavior is a function and symptoms are created in order to impact the environment so that the environment will respond in a way that reduces the deviation between the person's perception of the environment in relationship to them in terms of their psychological goal state. Period. Just reduces it. That's the purpose of the behavior and the purposes of symptoms. Okay? So the behavior then has an impact on the environment. And the impact is the other person's response or the social field or the context. Again, re-emphasizing that lifestyle is an open system. And then that environmental response becomes feedback. So what we can see, and those of you trained in Adlerian psychology, this is not new for you. But what I hope is that this is clearer to you. And also what I hope is that it's clearer to you how Adlerian lifestyle theory and explanation of behavior is a systems theory. And it is, I think, the one of the few, if not the only, and certainly the best personality theory that is a systems theory in terms of closeness. It's actually rather remarkable that Adler would develop this kind of theory in the absence of having systems theory as a framework, because it is so close to this logic. The other thing that happens is that behavior, this depression behavior, it becomes, you don't say, well, why is this person doing this? Why is this person excessively sad, or why is this person some of the behaviors that are here, losing or gaining weight? The answer is not because they're depressed. That's redundant. Hope that becomes clear to you. When you adopt a systemic perspective of the person as a whole, so that we look at the behavior in both the social context and the subjective context, then what we see from that totality of a perspective is that the behavior is not a result of the depression, that the behavior is caused by the goal state and the attempt to maintain the goal state. That's why the behavior is just as the attempt, just as the heat turns on the thermostat. There are some differences between people and thermostats, thank goodness, but this is a similarity to the extent that we're talking about stable, repetitive kinds of patterns. Now, the other thing that systems theory does when applied to an individual, and remember, the family systems theory knows nothing about this. They do not do this. Nobody does this. Well, we're doing it. But aside from that, nobody does it. Very few people look at a person as a system in this way. And the only way I can do that is because of Adlerian psychology. I and my students, in 1978, I believe, at an Adlerian conference, presented a systems theory of lifestyle. It was right after I learned this stuff. And so we all did it. But now it comes back. That was before family systems theory was popular. So one of the things that I want to say about this is Adlerian psychology, for those of you either new or even old to Adlerian psychology, is very interesting in that, and it revolves, so pertains to the question that was asked earlier about the individual and calling it individual psychology versus the social group. Adlerian psychology simultaneously is interested in two things which are always separated in other theories and are difficult to integrate, even in Adlerian psychology. On the one hand, it's the subjective phenomenology of the person. You can't understand anything unless you understand their subjective point of view and unless you understand their psychological goal. That's all inside the person. On the other hand, you can't understand the person unless you understand the social environment. That's outside the person. So on the one hand, they got us looking inside the person, all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, got us looking outside the person. And you may be wondering, how does all this fit together? Well, this is a way of looking at how it fits together in Adlerian theory. That in an open system, you have interchange between the inside and the outside. You cannot understand. The organism can't maintain itself. It can't survive unless there's interchange with the environment. Psychologically, that's how this works. The goal that is internal is directly related to the behavior that's designed to affect the environment, so that the relationship between the person system and the environment maintains a steady state. It's not just internal that the steady state is maintained, it's in the relationship with the environment. So that's why the environmental side, the social side, is intimately linked to the phenomenological individual inside the person side. Okay? Example of a woman who was depressed. And this is why we ask these questions. Asked her, well, what happens when you're depressed? Well, I lie in bed all day. What's the next question?
Who is most affected by that?
Good. I ask it in a more open-ended way, and then it says, what happens when you lie in bed all day? You just substitute the last thing they said for the question, and what happens now? But that would be a good way of asking it too. Who is most affected? But they can say, well, what do you mean by that? You know, so I don't want them to get suspicious or feel like I'm accusing them. Well, and the answer to that question is, well, my husband and the kids have to do the laundry and wash the dishes, and I feel terrible about that. Yeah, it's just awful. Okay, and as an Adlerian systems theorist, we're thinking, potential purpose of behavior, revenge against family and husband, because from an Adlerian point of view, all behavior is not done without some, unless it's successful, some payoff kind of way. And what does that mean? What that means is that there is a goal of that behavior, and that behavior that is used works. It achieves the goal, at least in the mind of the behavior, in the unconscious mind of the behavior. By the way, I may have mentioned, I'm not sure if I mentioned this example before, but it's a woman that I worked with a long time ago, and she was depressed. She had been depressed for many years, saw a psychiatrist who gave her medication, which didn't help, but continued to do it. 15 years she saw a psychiatrist. And through our work together, she began to see that, as was true for many depressed people, one of their beliefs and one of their goals, which wasn't mentioned here, is that I must be good. I must be a good boy, I must be a good girl. And good boys and good girls don't get angry. And they don't cause trouble for other people. So they eliminate from their repertoire behavioral responses that might make other people angry or perceive them as being nasty. They have to be good. So what do? Well, one thing that they do is they get depressed and they stay in bed. And other people have to do all these chores. And they get to achieve revenge while still looking to themselves and others that, if not for this depression, I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't do this to my family. It's my depression that does it to my family. Which is the way of avoiding responsibility for the symptom, and it's the purpose of the why the symptom gets developed. Now, we made some progress. And as a result, going on one of her many trips, where her husband would take her on a lot of trips. It sounds good. The problem is that he would take her on business trips. And they would go to Hawaii, really great places, and then he'd go into business meetings. And for years she did that, and she felt guilty for being depressed or even a little bit angry, because she didn't have a right to do this. She was free, he was bringing her. As a result of our work on a trip to Hawaii, I think it was a result of our work, yeah, it probably was, because she hadn't done this before, She got angry with him for spending all this time in meetings and got even a little bit demanding, saying, I want to spend time with you. I want you to spend time with me. Know what happened? You don't know what happened. Why am I asking that? He called the psychiatrist in Los Angeles. The psychiatrist in Los Angeles told the husband that she was regressing and acting like an adolescent, and that she needed to be hospitalized. And so they flew her back to LA. She was hospitalized. I never got a call, so I had to tell her that I couldn't work with her anymore, because I can't work with someone where I'm not in control of, or at least informed of such decision. But one of the usefulness of our work together is that it did break her away from that psychiatrist, because she did get a referral for a different psychiatrist who also did psychotherapy, and has been helped since. But and she called me saying, gee, you know, I've been in the hospital for 3 weeks. It's really great. They take great care of me. It's really wonderful. And so it was maintaining, and this is an example of the system in terms of the way in which the father, there's good slip, the husband / father, the husband and the psychiatrist collude to keep her in the same place in terms of the homeostasis of the marriage, because that's to keep her quiet. And when she was, it also shows you how different ways of looking at behavior depending on your frame of reference, because when the psychiatrist said she was regressing, I took the same, because she was acting as an adolescent, I took the same behavior and the same developmental stage and said she just progressed 6 or 7 years. Because what's her usual response is more like a 7 or 8-year-old who is just a good girl. You know. So now she was rebelling as an adolescent, but that was progress. But the system couldn't tolerate it. Okay. Number 7. Morphostasis. Morpho means shape or form. Morphology is the study of form. Metamorphosis is the change of form, like a caterpillar to a butterfly. So morph just means form. And stasis means steady. So morphostasis is characteristic also of systems. And that's the quality of systems where that they tend to maintain their form, tend to maintain their structure. And when somebody acts in line with their expectations, the whole idea of compensatory striving, purposeness of symptoms, hidden lifestyle movement designed to maintain the status quo, all of these are examples of morphostatic processes, where the person attempts to maintain their lifestyle. Whenever you talk about maintaining the lifestyle, in systems terms, you're talking about morphostasis. The lifestyle is an organizational structure, and the person works to maintain or behaves in such a way, lives in such a way to maintain that. That doesn't mean it can't be changed, because all of this is relatively stable. And that's, again, a very important way in which Adler's concepts are systemic concepts, because it doesn't mean that they're fixed forever. It means that there can be change. And in fact, if you have an environmental shift, then in order for the person to survive, the organism to survive, the organism needs to shift and adapt. And one of the ways of looking at therapy as a relationship is that it places that relatively homeostatic person system in an environment and a situation where the environment shifts in a peculiar way that makes it very difficult for the homeostatic process to continue working relative to the goal. This is another way of explaining spitting in the patient's soup. Because what you're doing is you are, as an environmental feedback thing, it's real eloquent, sprite, feedback sprite. What you're doing is you're feeding back information that's very difficult to assimilate in the usual way. And so it changes things. You also reframe the goal, also changes the system. I wanted to share with you, for those of you who haven't never ran across this in the individual psychology of Alfred Adler, one of the few examples of Adler doing therapy was with a depressed woman. And it gives an example of how Adler, as an environmental response, tries to change and not fit into the person's movement and goal. And how the person, operating from a homeostatic lifestyle perspective, tries to continue to respond to maintain the goal, and despite the deviance that Adler is trying to introduce. And the interchange went like this. At the end, she was melancholic, which was the description for depression back then. And so upon leaving, she's just about to leave, and he says, well, I want you to go home and only do what you want to do. Recognizing that her goal is to not do anything that she wants to do. All right? So he's creating a shift in that, and we're trying to reframe the goal, deviating from her goal state. What does she say? She says, well, I don't want to do anything. When Adler says that the client is out to defeat the therapist, that's in systems terms, the client will try to maintain their goal state in the face of you trying to change it. So one of the things Adler does is say, don't try to change it. Align your goal with the goal of the client. You've heard that? You heard that? Align your goal with the goal of the client. Have you ever thought of that in systems theory terms, in terms of homeostatic system? Hopefully that'll help, because what you're doing is you are interacting so that it doesn't create deviation from the goal in a way that the person can continue their behaviors. So what Adler said next was, so you remember, it starts off with, well, I want you to go home and do only what you want to do. And she says, well, I don't want to do anything. And he said, then above all, don't do anything that you don't want to do.
Humorous form of detail.
Clever guy. Well, she didn't find it funny. It's just a reframe. It's very, very clever. So he's trying to maintain his goal, at the same time reframing hers. But she's a match for him. She says, well, if I did that, then I wouldn't know anything. I'd just stay in bed all day. And he said, well, that's exactly what you ought to do. I remember the first time I read that. Now, first of all, do you see that in terms of maintaining the lifestyle goal, and therapists trying to align the goal with the goal of the client so that you're moving in the same direction so that the person isn't fighting with you, you're not fighting with the person. But the first time I read that is, this guy is interested in stimulating social interest in his clients? And he's saying, stay in bed all day? I did not understand that. That did not make any sense to me. And it was only later that I realized the depth of what that means. That in therapy, the therapist's goal in stimulating social interest in the client occurs through the relationship of the therapist with the client. And to the extent that social interest is based on cooperation, it requires of the therapist cooperation with the client. You can't require the client to cooperate with you. If they could do that, they wouldn't be paying you for therapy. Like I like to say to my students when they come in and they're complaining about their clients. You know what my client did? He came in here and I'm doing this and this and she keeps doing that and that. And I said, she just read the job description for being a client. That's what the clients are supposed to do. They're supposed to not cooperate with you. That's why they're clients. That's why they're neurotic. If they didn't do that, we'd be out of a profession. We wouldn't need you. You know, it's not like they should stop doing this so that I can, you know, be helpful. This is exactly what you need to be helpful with. But yeah, how do you do that? It just depends on the intuition of the therapist, where the therapist wants to focus. Okay. So we talked about morphostasis. Morphogenesis is very interesting. Morphogenic processes are processes which change the form or structure and or the organization of a system. And they do this through what are called deviation amplifying feedback loops or positive feedback loops. We talk about negative feedback loops where we're trying to reduce the deviation. Positive feedback loops expand the deviation. Sometimes that's negative, sometimes it's positive. An example, negative in the sense of not healthy, not bad, but an example of a deviation amplifying feedback loop I have in terms of attention-getting behavior that escalates to power. If you have attention-getting behavior, and the response on the part of the parent is to give attention, and the child then escalates and wants power. Or actually, a better example would be where the parent doesn't give attention, and then the child triggers. That triggers a power-oriented stuff, and the response of the parent is punitive, and then that triggers further revenge kind of behavior on the part of the child. Then we have a situation that's not homeostatic, it's morphogenic, it's spinning out of control, that the deviation keeps getting greater. Okay? So that's an example of deviation amplifying. There are times when deviation amplifying is helpful. For example, in evolution, when you have a change, let's say the temperature gets much colder. There's an ice age. Okay, so the temperature drops, and the species have to adapt to the new environment. And the only way that it can adapt is by creating a change. Now, there are different ways that they can achieve that. This is different methods of achieving a goal is called equifinality. Finality refers to the final goal, like the teleological concept, and equi means, you know, equivalent or the same. That there are many ways to achieve a particular goal. So let's take the goal of adapting, a species adapting to a significant decrease in temperature. One of the things species could do is they could migrate south. All right? And if they successfully migrated toward warmer temperatures, that then they're basically recreating the environment or changing their environment so that it would be the same as it used to be in terms of the external temperature. That would be one way of solving the problem of adaptation. Another would be learn how to build insulated houses or compartments or igloos or something so that you could create a different environment that would maintain warmth even though your environment has become cold. Another would be to grow fur. And to, you know, over a period of generations, so the ones that got hairier would be the ones that survived. So these are all different ways that a species can pursue a goal of adaptation that requires some kind of change. Now, the movement south might not require a morphogenic change, unless you had to grow bigger leg muscles or something to be able to move. But certainly the growing of hair would involve a change, a morphogenic change. So sometimes species need to change in order to adapt to a new environment. And ontologically, so do individuals. So this is the other side of the systems equation. One side is the stability, which is well captured by the homeostatic process. The other side is change. And languages of change and theories of change are not as prevalent in psychology and even systems theory and family systems theory as language of stability. And those of you who have taken courses at the Institute have learned about lifestyle and then kind of felt like you didn't really know how to change lifestyle. You knew how to identify lifestyle, but now what do I do with it? I think you have an accurate perception of your learning, because the vast amount of learning is devoted to understanding lifestyle dynamics. The learning to change lifestyle dynamics is more difficult to learn. It's more difficult to teach. It's much harder to teach because it is a personal learning process. Because as a therapist, you're a tool, you're an artist, and you need to assimilate the kinds of methods that work, but also they have to work for you. So what works for someone else may not work for you. So you have to put your own stamp on it, and so that's a much longer process. Okay, now I mentioned earlier two guys who have done work that is really recent in terms of a new kind of systems theory, and here they are. And the Tree of Knowledge is their most accessible book, and one of their most interesting. And so one of the things that they emphasize is that all living systems, or all living organisms, are characterized by self-determination and self-organization. Now, to Adlerian ears, that's really an interesting thing for biologists to say, because that is certainly what Adler talked about in terms of the active organism, the active person, the creative self, things that in other psychologies he has been criticized for. And the way that they elaborate this idea of self-determination and self-organization is, first of all, they call living systems autopoietic systems. Here you can see the specifics of it. Auto refers to self. Greek, the word poiesis means renewal or regeneration. So autopoietic systems, they use that term to describe self-renewing systems. And that the key characteristic of all living systems is that they continually regenerate themselves, and that's their main goal, to regenerate themselves. Their main product is themselves and the regeneration of it themselves. And so from an Adlerian point of view, a key characteristic of the lifestyle is to regenerate itself. That's why the lifestyle tends to remain stable. But if the lifestyle is moved into a different situation, into an environment that's different, then that stability is threatened. One of the things that Adler used, he used a metaphor, and it's described in the Individual Psychology of Alfred Adler in terms of when the reason why you have to use early recollections to understand lifestyle, unless the person is in crisis. Anybody remember the metaphor? It's a tree. A person, when their lifestyle is well prepared for whatever situations they're in, then they will be like a tree in a forest. And it's very difficult to see the configuration or form of their lifestyle unless you look at their early recollections. But if this tree is standing alone on top of a hill, no other trees around it, in an environment which is not well suited for, then the lifestyle becomes obvious. So when people encounter situations that their lifestyle is not well prepared for, then through their symptoms and their behavior we begin to see the evidence of their lifestyle. So the idea of self-renewing and self-regenerating lifestyle is consistent with Adler's point of view. It's also consistent with other levels of systems thinking, like family systems or social systems. They also tend to function in a way that emphasizes their own self-regeneration. Number 11, the crucial feature of a self-stabilizing or autopoietic system is not so much found in the preservation of homeostatic circular equilibrium. So here we're going beyond the homeostatic process. But rather is found in the maintenance of a coherence of one's ordering processes by continuous ordering restructurings, so that there's a continuous restructuring that maintains this process. And the restructuring involves a balance between morphostatic, homeostatic, in other words, maintaining the form, the shape, the stability processes, on the one hand, and on the other hand, morphogenetic processes which will change the form to fit new situations. And you need a kind of a combination of both. Certainly the species needs a combination of both, but people need a combination of both as well. And in fact, one of the ways of seeing a person who's in trouble, people that come to us for treatment, is that their homeostatic lifestyle processes are not adapting well to their situation. And they don't know how to change it. They don't know how to shift. They don't know how to shift their form, modify their form. Looking at Adler's beyond homeostasis, the idea of beyond the notion of lifestyle as a homeostatic system, Adler's view that all life is movement and that everything can be different, and Dreiker's view that no habit is maintained if it loses its purpose, those ideas reflect the idea that we continuously regenerate our lifestyle, and that lifestyle can change and can reach a new coherence of ordering processes, in other words, a new lifestyle unity. And Adler and Dreiker's hypothesis of the creative self also is supported in this idea. So to summarize, the lifestyle as it develops and as it functions tends to be a homeostatic process around a steady state of a goal. But the human being also has, as part of its process, the capability of changing one's own style, one's own lifestyle. And referring back to the schema of systems theory with lifestyle, you can change that whole thing by changing any one of these things. Sometimes it's enough to change the behavior, the strategy of reaching the goal, and you can see improvement. Sometimes that's not enough, and we have to change some of the basic beliefs and cognitions. And that's sufficient, because then the behaviors will change in relationship to that. You don't have to really change the goal. On page 28 of What Life Should Mean to You, one of the things that Adler does is he talks about the example of a thief and the idea that the thief wants to get something for nothing. But in doing therapy with the thief, we may not have to change his goal. Only the way in which he makes it concrete is Adler's language. Only the way in which he makes it concrete. So we might be able to find other ways for the thief to acquire things, and change his method of acquiring. So, so the characteristic in that case is we're just changing the behavior. Sometimes we don't have to change the whole lifestyle. I once asked Bernie Shulman when I was in the internship in Chicago, what about a woman who he has just done an intake on. I was going to see her. I said, what does she need? He said, she needs a personality overhaul. that's one of all these. You're probably going to have to modify the goal. You got to change the beliefs. You got to change the behaviors. Got to work at all.